Thank you all for watching and supporting my videos. Your encouragement keeps me inspired to create even more content. My next big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and I can't do it without your help. If you enjoy what I create, hit that subscribe button and join me on this journey. Now let's dive into the stories. Samantha had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. After a long, exhausting year of work, she decided to book a secluded cabin through Airbnb, nestled in a remote corner of the forest, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The photos online showed a rustic yet charming place, complete with a cozy fireplace, scenic views, and an aura of tranquility. It seemed perfect. Upon arrival, the cabin looked even more inviting than in the photos. Surrounded by towering trees and the stillness of nature, it was the perfect place to disconnect and recharge. Samantha settled in, making herself at home, enjoying the quiet and the simple pleasure of solitude. The cabin had a slightly weathered feel, but it added to its charm, giving off an old-world vibe that made her feel like she had stepped into another time. The first night was peaceful, filled only with the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the crackle of the fire. But as Samantha settled into bed, a sense of unease started to creep in. It wasn't anything she could quite put her finger on, just a vague feeling that something wasn't right. She shook it off, telling herself she was being silly. After all, she had seen the reviews. No one had mentioned anything unusual about the place. The next morning, she woke up to find a note on the kitchen table. It was handwritten in a scrawled, almost rushed handwriting. "Don't go into the basement. Trust me. Leave while you still can." Her heart skipped a beat as she stared at the note. There was no name, no explanation. Just the unsettling warning. She quickly dismissed it as a prank left by the previous tenants, perhaps some quirky people who enjoyed leaving odd notes behind. Later that day, Samantha decided to take a hike through the woods to clear her mind, eager to forget about the note and the unease it had caused. The forest was dense, and the air felt heavy with a strange energy, but the hike was beautiful. Still, something gnawed at the back of her mind as she walked deeper into the woods. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. When she returned to the cabin, it was dusk. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. As she opened the door, she froze. There was a faint sound coming from the basement, soft, muffled, like something or someone was moving down there. Her pulse quickened. For a moment, she stood frozen in place. It had to be the wind. Or maybe the house settling. But the noise persisted. She didn't want to go down there, but curiosity won out. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly descended the narrow staircase leading to the basement door. The air grew colder the closer she got. When she reached the basement, the door creaked open with a reluctant groan. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of old, dusty furniture and boxes. It looked like nothing more than a storage space untouched for years. But then her light landed on something strange, a small, old-fashioned mirror propped up against the wall. It wasn't there when she first arrived. As she stepped closer to it, a shiver ran down her spine. The reflection in the mirror wasn't quite right. The room behind her seemed darker than it should have been. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty basement, cold and silent. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, and turned back to the mirror. This time she saw it more clearly. The reflection was shifting, moving ever so slightly, like something was behind her, just out of sight. Her stomach churned with dread. A sudden noise from upstairs broke the silence, footsteps. Someone was walking around in the cabin. It couldn't be the wind. It wasn't the house settling. She knew she was alone. Or was she? Panic set in as she rushed back up the stairs, heart pounding. She checked every room but found no one. The house was still. Too still. But then, in the corner of her eye, she saw something. A shadow, fleeting, moving quickly across the room. She turned, but it was gone. With no other options, she decided to leave. Grabbing her things, she rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't open. She yanked at the handle, but it felt as if the door was locked from the other side. Her pulse raced. She could hear the faint sound of breathing. Deep, slow, deliberate. It was then that she realized she wasn't alone in the cabin. Not anymore. Samantha's heart pounded as she tried again to open the door. It didn't budge. Panic began to claw at her chest. The sound of slow, deliberate breathing was getting louder, echoing through the walls. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. Someone or something was here with her. She backed away from the door, her mind racing. The basement, the strange mirror, the note, everything was connected. But how? What? And who was that breathing? She tried to think, to calm herself, but it was no use. The darkness in the cabin seemed to close in on her. She couldn't see anyone, yet she felt their presence, like a shadow lurking just beyond her line of sight. Every creak of the floorboards above her, every shift in the air made her jump. Desperation set in. She grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. She tried texting her family, but the messages wouldn't go through. The cabin was completely cut off from the outside world. She was alone. Or was she? Suddenly the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire house held its breath, waiting. Samantha stood frozen, listening, every sense alert. Then from upstairs came a whisper, soft, almost imperceptible. "Leave. Now." It was the same voice from the note, but this time it sounded like it was right next to her. She spun around, but no one was there. Her body felt like it was moving on its own, her legs carrying her toward the staircase without her consent. She had to leave. She had to escape. With trembling hands, she grabbed the flashlight and made her way toward the front door again, praying it would open this time. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding her prisoner. This time, the door opened with a groan, as if it had been waiting for her to try again. She rushed out onto the porch, breathing in the cool night air like she was drowning. She wasn't safe yet. She had to get out of here, away from this place, away from whatever was haunting her. But as she stepped off the porch and into the yard, she froze. There, in the distance, standing among the trees at the edge of the woods, was a figure. Tall and still, its shape barely discernible in the dim light. It didn't move. It just stood there watching her. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't see its face, but she felt it looking at her, its gaze cold and knowing. The same feeling of being watched from earlier surged through her. The figure didn't speak, didn't gesture. It just stared. Samantha's instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure didn't move. The silence felt suffocating, broken only by the sound of her rapid breathing. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. Without warning, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Samantha didn't wait to process what she had just seen. She didn't care if it was real or a trick of her mind. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth, her body propelled by sheer fear. The woods were dark, the path treacherous, but she didn't care. She couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, she stumbled onto the main road. Cars passed by, their headlights blinding in the night, but she didn't stop to wave them down. She kept running until finally she reached a small town several miles away. Breathless and exhausted, she collapsed on a bench outside a gas station, trying to regain her composure. A local officer stopped by, asking if she was all right. She tried to explain, but her words came out in a jumbled mess. He nodded sympathetically, perhaps thinking she was just another weary traveler who had gone a little too far off the beaten path. When she finally managed to catch her breath, he asked her about the cabin. Samantha hesitated. Should she tell him everything? Should she warn others? I think it's haunted, she finally managed to say, her voice shaking. The officer's expression hardened. There's a lot of strange stories about that place, he said quietly. You're not the first one to leave in the middle of the night. Samantha's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Some people who've stayed there, well, they leave with more than just memories. Strange things happen in that cabin. But no one can ever prove it. They say it's been abandoned before, then it mysteriously opens up for Airbnb bookings. No one really knows who owns it. Samantha shuddered. Was she just another victim of this cursed place? Or was there something more to it? Her mind raced as she thought about the figure in the woods. Who or what was it? The officer glanced at her with a knowing look. I'd suggest you stay far away from that cabin. People have tried to go back, but none of them ever seemed to come out the same. She didn't need to hear more. She turned away, her heart still racing, knowing she had narrowly escaped something dark, something that could never be explained. As she left the town, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still watching her, waiting for her to return. Months passed and Samantha tried her best to move on from the haunting experience at the cabin. She kept herself busy with work, and when she found herself thinking about it, she would push the memories aside. But the feeling lingered, the weight of it growing heavier with each passing day. She couldn't escape the sensation that something from that night had followed her back into her life. One evening, as she was sorting through her email inbox, she noticed an unexpected message. It was from Airbnb, a reminder to leave a review for the cabin she had stayed at months ago. Samantha's blood ran cold. How was this possible? She had already checked out. She hadn't left any review. She clicked the email with hesitation, wondering if this was just some mistake. The message was brief, just a link to the cabin's page on the site. A new note was attached. "We hope your stay was pleasant. Thank you for choosing us." Samantha clicked the link. Her heart nearly stopped. The listing for the cabin was still live. But what struck her was the date. The cabin was marked as available for bookings again. It shouldn't have been, it had been listed as permanently unavailable months ago. She stared at the screen, her hand trembling as she scrolled through the photos once more. The place seemed to have changed. The once charming rustic cabin now appeared almost dilapidated, as if time had taken a toll on it in the short time since she left. A flicker of something moved in the corner of one of the photos. A shadow, just like the one she had seen in the woods. Unable to stop herself, Samantha made a split-second decision. She called the number listed on the Airbnb page. The phone rang and then after a long pause a voice picked up. "Hello." The voice was calm, almost too calm. "Who is this?" Samantha's voice was strained. There was a brief silence on the other end before the voice replied, "This is the cabin owner. I've been expecting your call." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, expecting my call?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. "You stayed in the cabin," the voice continued, almost as if it were reading her thoughts. "I know what happened. And I know you're curious about it. You should have left when you had the chance." Samantha's pulse quickened. "What is this? What happened there?" "You felt it, didn't you?" The voice was almost a whisper. "The presence. It's not a ghost. It's not a spirit. It's something older, something that's been there long before you. The cabin is merely the vessel. It calls to people, those who are open to it. And it doesn't let them go." Samantha felt her stomach turn. "Why did you put it on Airbnb? Why did you let people stay there?" There was a long pause. Then the voice answered coldly, "Because it needs them. And it feeds on them. The cabin is part of something bigger. A place where time bends, where memories fade, and where people are never truly alone. You are not the first to feel its pull. And you won't be the last." Samantha's hand shook violently as she dropped the phone. Her mind was racing, trying to comprehend the words, but none of it made sense. How could something like this exist? Why hadn't anyone else ever said anything? The room around her seemed to darken, the weight of the conversation pressing in on her chest. She could almost hear the faint whisper again, this time inside her head. "Leave while you still can." But it was too late. Something had already followed her. A knock at her door. Samantha froze. Her eyes widened in horror. She hadn't heard anyone approach. She hadn't seen anyone. But the knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly stood up. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to escape, but her feet felt glued to the floor. She approached the door, trembling. The knock came again, harder this time, followed by a voice that was chillingly familiar. "Let me in." Her heart hammered in her chest. She knew the voice. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the basement. Without thinking, she turned and ran. She grabbed her keys and rushed to the back door, but it wouldn't open. The windows were all sealed shut. The house felt alive, closing in around her. Samantha's breath became shallow, her hands slick with sweat. She turned back toward the front door, but it was already wide open, the shadow from the hallway stretching toward her like a dark hand reaching for her soul. And standing in the doorway as if it had always been there, was the figure. Tall, still, and watching her. Its eyes were empty, dark voids, and its smile, if you could call it that, was twisted and wrong. Samantha knew in that moment that she would never escape. Whatever had followed her from that cabin was now part of her reality. And there was no running from it. As she felt the darkness close in, she finally understood the truth. There were some places that never truly let you go. And the cabin in the woods? It was never really abandoned. It was always waiting. Sarah had always been a fan of unique getaways, and Airbnb was her go-to for discovering hidden retreats. This time she had found something special, an old Victorian mansion in the heart of the countryside. The house, known as the Hollow Manor, was surrounded by vast woods and towering trees, offering a sense of isolation that Sarah found appealing. The description of the listing sounded charming: a historic mansion with antique furnishings, a quiet retreat away from the world. Perfect for a weekend of rest, she thought. When Sarah arrived at the Hollow Manor, the sight of the mansion took her breath away. It stood tall, shrouded in fog, its ivy-covered stone walls and weathered windows giving it a mysterious, almost haunted vibe. But she was undeterred. The property had an air of elegance, albeit one that felt slightly out of time. As Sarah walked inside, she noticed the house was beautifully furnished with vintage decor, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. The floors creaked with each step, and the faint scent of old wood and dust filled her senses. She checked the Airbnb listing again. It looked exactly like the photos, yet there was something unsettling about the place. The host, Mr. Holloway, had left a note on the dining table for her. It read, "Welcome to the Hollow Manor, Sarah. I hope you enjoy your stay. Please make yourself comfortable. Should you need anything, I'm just a phone call away." There was something about the way the note was worded that sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she brushed it off. It was probably just the unusual atmosphere of the old house. That night, Sarah settled into one of the rooms upstairs. The air grew colder as she pulled the blankets tightly around her. The house seemed to be alive with strange sounds, creaking doors, faint footsteps on the floors above. At first, she convinced herself it was just the house settling, but the noises persisted, becoming more distinct and unsettling. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was there with her. Around midnight, Sarah woke to the sound of soft footsteps outside her door. Her heart raced as she listened, wondering if it was her mind playing tricks. But the footsteps grew louder, slowly approaching her room. She held her breath, waiting for the sound to stop, but it didn't. Instead, the door handle slowly began to turn. Frozen with fear, Sarah watched as the door creaked open just slightly, revealing nothing but darkness in the hallway. No one was there. Confused, she checked the hallway, but it was empty. She thought she must have imagined it. She locked the door and tried to calm herself, but the unsettling feeling wouldn't leave. The next morning, Sarah decided to explore the house in the daylight, hoping it would help ease her nerves. As she wandered through the corridors, she came across a hidden room behind a large, ornate mirror. It was small, cluttered with old furniture and covered in dust. But in the corner of the room, a large portrait hung on the wall. The painting was of a man in an old-fashioned suit, with sharp eyes and an unsettling expression. It looked like Mr. Holloway but much younger. Sarah felt drawn to the portrait, her curiosity getting the best of her. As she leaned closer, she noticed something strange. There was a small handwritten note tucked behind the frame. It read, "She never leaves." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Was it referring to her? Or someone else? That evening, Sarah decided to leave. The strange occurrences were too much for her to handle. She gathered her things and went to find her keys, but when she reached the front door, she stopped dead in her tracks. The door was locked. She tried to unlock it, but the key wouldn't turn. Panic set in as she fumbled with the lock. Then a voice, low and gravelly, came from behind her. "You can't leave." Sarah spun around, her heart racing. There, standing in the doorway to the living room, was a figure. It was Mr. Holloway, but his appearance was different. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his smile was unnaturally wide. He stepped forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "What do you mean?" Sarah stammered, backing away. "This house doesn't let people go. You're already one of us," he said in a voice that sent a jolt of terror through her body. The walls of the mansion seemed to close in around her as she turned to run. But no matter which way she went, the same dark hallway stretched endlessly before her. Each door led her back to the living room, and Mr. Holloway was always waiting, his grin growing wider with each attempt to escape. As the hours dragged on, Sarah realized there was no way out. The house, with its cold, oppressive atmosphere, was alive with something darker, something ancient. It had trapped her, and it would never let her go. She had become another part of the Hollow Manor, another piece in its twisted history, destined to never leave. The next morning when new guests arrived, they found the house empty. The rooms were perfectly tidy, the lights flickered only slightly, and the air was still. But when they checked the guest book, they found a note scribbled on the last page. She never leaves. And then the footsteps began again. Weeks passed and the new guests settled in, unaware of the history that clung to the hollow manor. One couple, James and Emily, arrived on a crisp autumn evening, eager to spend their weekend away from the city. The mansion was just as charming as the listing had described, and they quickly grew fond of its old-world charm. The atmosphere was serene at first, peaceful, untouched, and full of character. But as the night settled in, strange things began to happen. It started with small things. The door to the kitchen creaked open on its own. The lights flickered in the hallway, then the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed through the rooms. James dismissed it as an old house settling, but Emily felt uneasy. There was something about the place that didn't sit right with her. One evening, while exploring the mansion, they stumbled upon a room hidden behind a dusty bookshelf. The door was old and barely opened, revealing a small, dark space with cobwebs in every corner. A portrait of Mr. Holloway, younger than in the previous version Emily had seen, hung in the far corner of the room. Below the portrait was a small table with an old, tarnished key. Emily stepped closer, intrigued by the strange setup. As she reached for the key, she saw something etched into the wall, faint, almost imperceptible at first glance. She never leaves. The message was unsettling, but James only laughed it off, suggesting it was just another odd quirk of the house. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, a loud knock on their door startled them. They froze, exchanging nervous glances. Who could be knocking at this hour? James opened the door to find no one there. He stepped into the hallway, scanning the shadows. Nothing. But the air felt colder and a sense of dread settled in. They decided to turn in early, but sleep eluded them. Emily's mind raced, thinking of the strange message, the key, the portrait, and the warning that echoed in her head. She never leaves. A chill ran down her spine as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The clock struck midnight and she heard it, soft, slow footsteps coming from the hallway. It sounded like someone was walking toward their room. Heart pounding, Emily glanced at James, who was still fast asleep. She tried to call out to him, but her voice caught in her throat. The door handle turned and Emily's breath caught in her chest. The door creaked open, but there was no one on the other side. She could feel a presence, someone standing just beyond the threshold, watching her. Emily's pulse raced as she slowly got out of bed, moving toward the door. She reached for the light switch, but when she flipped it, the bulb exploded with a sharp pop. Darkness consumed the room. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, soft and distant but unmistakably clear, "You're not supposed to be here." Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to scream, but her voice failed her. She backed away from the door, stumbling into the corner of the room. The whisper grew louder, now a sinister hiss, just inches from her ear. "You are the one who never leaves." Emily couldn't take it anymore. She bolted from the room, her heart racing. She rushed down the stairs, desperately searching for an exit, but no matter where she turned, the walls seemed to close in around her. The house felt alive, twisting, shifting, trapping her in its endless corridors. She found James standing at the foot of the stairs, looking disoriented and pale. "What happened?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "They're here. They won't let us leave," Emily gasped, panic rising in her chest. As she turned toward the front door, hoping to break free, she saw him, the figure of Mr. Holloway, standing in the doorway, blocking their only escape. His eyes were cold and empty, his smile twisted into something inhuman. "You didn't listen," Mr. Holloway said softly, his voice echoing through the hallway. "You never should have come." James stepped forward, reaching for Emily, but he stopped, his face paling as he stared at the man. "We need to leave. Now." But Mr. Holloway didn't move. Instead, his smile grew wider, and his eyes seemed to darken with an unnatural hunger. He raised one hand and the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The couple backed away, their minds spiraling into fear. The house was no longer the peaceful retreat they thought it would be. It had become a prison, an ancient, cursed vessel that claimed those who dared enter. They were trapped. They tried every door, every window, but nothing would open. It was as if the house itself had swallowed them whole. Hours passed in a blur, the air thick with tension and dread. They could hear whispers in the walls, and the house seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. Every corner they turned led them back to the living room, where Mr. Holloway stood, watching them. "You belong here now," he said, his voice colder than before. "You've been chosen. Like her. Like all the others." Emily's eyes widened with terror as the realization hit her. This wasn't the first time this had happened. The house had claimed others and it would continue to claim more. The whispers intensified, and as Sarah had before them, they too would become part of the Hollow Manor's endless cycle, never to leave. The mansion had been waiting for them, and now it was theirs forever. As the first rays of dawn filtered through the windows, a new note appeared on the guest book, scratched hastily in the back. "They never leave." And the house waited, ready to claim the next guest who dared enter its walls. Days passed since James and Emily had arrived at the Hollow Manor, but it felt like an eternity. As the morning sun cast its weak light over the mansion's walls, the house seemed to come alive with the sounds of whispers, groans, and the shifting of old floorboards. The shadows grew longer, and the air became thick with an unbearable weight. Inside, the two were prisoners, moving aimlessly through the vast rooms that no longer seemed to make sense. The layout of the house was warping, shifting, as if the walls themselves were breathing. They tried to leave the living room, only to find themselves back where they started, staring at the figure of Mr. Holloway, who would silently watch them with that unnerving grin. It was as if the house was rearranging itself around them, trapping them in its never-ending maze. The days began to blur. They no longer knew what was real and what was simply part of the house's twisted design. Emily's eyes had started to dull, her once vibrant face now pale and tired. She could feel her mind slipping away, the whispers getting louder, the voices more urgent. At night, she would hear them calling her name, a cacophony of voices pulling her deeper into the house's heart. James too began to change. His once bright, confident demeanor was replaced with the hollow look in his eyes. He had stopped speaking to Emily, as if resigned to the house's grip. It was clear the house had broken them. The curse was wearing them down, consuming them from within. One evening, Emily woke to find herself alone in the cold, dark room. James was nowhere to be found. Panic flooded her chest as she called his name, but no answer came. The house had taken him. She could feel it, the unmistakable tug of something darker, something far more powerful than she could comprehend. She had no choice but to continue searching. She had to find him. As she moved through the mansion's halls, her footsteps echoed loudly in the silence. The once charming decor had become grotesque, the furniture askew and covered in dust. Paintings that once seemed quaint now stared at her with sinister eyes. The walls groaned, and a faint sobbing sound drifted from behind one of the doors. Emily pushed the door open, her breath catching in her throat. There, in the corner of the room, sat James. He was motionless, his face pale and twisted in fear. His eyes were wide, filled with terror, but his body remained unmoving. "James?" she cried, rushing toward him. She knelt beside him, shaking him, but he didn't respond. His skin was cold, his breath shallow. It was as if he had been frozen in time. A voice from behind her sent a chill down her spine. "He's not the same anymore." She turned to see Mr. Holloway standing in the doorway, his figure more imposing than ever. His eyes glinted with an unnatural light, his smile widening into something monstrous. "He's part of the house now," Mr. Holloway continued. "And so will you be." Emily's heart raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around the room for any escape. But the walls had closed in, the door now nothing more than a faded memory. She was trapped. "Please. I don't want to stay here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Please let me go. I'll leave. I'll never come back." Mr. Holloway's smile didn't falter. "You think you have a choice? You belong to the Hollow Manor now. You've been chosen just like all the others. You cannot escape." Suddenly the room began to shift. The walls distorted, bending inward. The floorboards creaked as if something was crawling beneath them. Emily's vision blurred, and she could feel her mind starting to break. The whispers had turned into screams, deafening and unrelenting. Her vision spun as shadows twisted around her, blocking her view of everything but the haunting face of Mr. Holloway. As she stumbled back, she caught sight of the portrait of Mr. Holloway that had been hung in every room. It was now different, His eyes were no longer the cold, distant gaze she'd seen before. They were staring right at her, full of hunger and malice. And beneath the image she saw the same words she had seen before. She never leaves. Emily's heart stopped. She understood now. She had become part of the house, just like all the others before her. There was no escape. No hope. James' figure began to stir beside her. Slowly he turned his head, his eyes now empty, his face gaunt and lifeless. He was no longer the man she had known. He was another lost soul, bound to the house forever. As Emily sank to her knees, she could feel her own mind slipping away, her sense of reality becoming more distorted with each passing moment. The house was claiming her, slowly erasing every trace of who she was. Her screams echoed, but they were swallowed by the dark, oppressive air of the hollow manor. And so the cycle continued. The next day the guest book was filled with new entries, names of people who had stayed in the house, all of them crossed out with the same chilling message: they never leave. And once again the hollow manor waited patiently for its next guests, ready to claim them too. The house had no end, no escape. Only the endless whispers of the souls it had taken, trapped forever in its dark, endless corridors. The days passed, but in the hollow manor, time had lost its meaning. Emily, or whatever remained of her, wandered through the rooms, her thoughts fragmented, her identity fading into the very fabric of the house. The once peaceful air now hung heavy with the oppressive presence of the many souls trapped within the mansion's walls. James, no longer the man she had known, stayed close by her side, his empty eyes never leaving her. He moved like a shadow, an echo of the person he once was, trapped in a cycle of existence far beyond death. Together they were part of the house now, just as Sarah and countless others before them had been. Outside, the world continued to turn, unaware of the horrors inside the hollow manor. The mansion stood as it always had, its windows reflecting nothing but the darkened sky, a place of forgotten memories and unspoken truths. No one ever thought to visit, no one dared come close. The house had a reputation, a history too eerie for anyone to challenge. And yet, the house remained patient as it had always been. The next group of guests arrived one foggy afternoon. The listing had been updated again with fresh pictures showcasing the charming estate and the perfect getaway it promised. The hollow manor had attracted attention once more. This time it was an older couple, eager to experience something new, seeking solitude far from the noise of the city. They didn't know what awaited them. The door creaked open, the scent of dust and old wood filling the air as they stepped inside. The house seemed quiet at first, almost welcoming in its isolation. But the moment they crossed the threshold, a chill filled the air. The walls seemed to close in, the silence unnerving. The couple, unaware of the mansion's sinister past, began to explore. Their footsteps echoed through the halls, unaware of the eyes that watched them from the shadows. In the farthest room of the house, behind the old bookshelf, a faint whisper stirred: "They never leave." The cycle was starting again. Inside, Emily and James watched from the corner of the darkened room, their eyes empty, their souls lost to the house. They could not speak, they could not warn. They were as much a part of the hollow manor now as the walls themselves. The house had taken them just as it would take these new souls. Just as it would take anyone who dared enter. And when the next entry was written in the guest book, it would read, "They never leave." The hollow manor would continue to wait, patiently, for the next to arrive.